In a kingdom where the sun kissed the earth with golden warmth, there lived a prince named Zubri, the only heir to the mighty throne of the kingdom of Elia. His father, King Mwamba, was a ruler known across the land for his strength, his command, and his unyielding will. The kingdom flourished under his reign, its warriors undefeated, and its wealth unmatched. But beneath this glory, something far darker simmered: fear. From the moment Zubri was born, his father had been haunted by his weakness. While the king's body was as solid as iron, Zubri's was frail, often plagued by sickness. His pale skin and fragile frame were a stark contrast to the image of a king that Mwamba had envisioned, one who would lead his people with an iron fist, strong and unrelenting. As the years passed, Zubri's illness grew worse. The king watched helplessly as his son, the future of the kingdom, remained locked in a sickbed more often than on the royal throne. A king cannot be weak. King Mwamba would mutter to himself in the darkness of his chambers. His fears festered into resentment, and in his mind, Zubri's fragility would be the ruin of the royal lineage. One night, after an especially harrowing episode where the prince collapsed while attempting to stand before the court, King Mwamba made a decision. The kingdom could not afford to have a weak heir, no matter the blood that ran through his veins. He would have to act before the whispers of Zubri's frailty reached too far. Desperation turned into cruelty. He could not allow his son to continue. The kingdom needed a ruler who could lead with strength, not one who could barely hold his own. In a chamber cloaked in shadows, the king summoned his most trusted servants. "Prepare a tomb," he commanded, his voice cold and hard, "and seal it with the earth. His time has come." Unbeknownst to Zubri, his father's mind had already made the decision. With a heavy heart, the king watched from afar as his son was carried to the royal burial grounds. The night was silent, save for the sound of the prince's faint breath as he was lowered into the grave. Zubri, though weak and feverish, had not yet succumbed to death. His last thoughts, as he lay in the coffin, were not of hatred or anger toward his father, but of sorrow. "I forgive you, father," he whispered, though no one could hear. And then, in the suffocating quiet of the tomb, the prince's breath seemed to stop. King Mwamba, satisfied with his decision, ordered the earth to be shoveled over his son's grave. The ground swallowed Zubri, and for the king, it felt like the final exhale of the royal line. But death had not claimed Zubri that night. Beneath the soil, his heart still beat, faintly, desperately, but undeniably alive. For days, Zubri's body remained entombed, trapped in the dark grave. His strength had failed him in life, but his spirit, it seemed, would not be bound by the earth. Through the long hours, as his mind drifted in and out of consciousness, Zubri felt an awakening inside of him, a power not of muscle, but of will. His body may have been frail, but his spirit had been forged in the fires of rejection and betrayal. It was not strength that made a king. It was the will to rise above. With final push, the earth above the coffin shifted. The prince, now determined, broke through the grave's hold on him. His body was weak, covered in dirt and bruised, but his eyes burned with something fierce, a fire that would not be extinguished. He emerged from the ground like a spirit called back from the dead. His bones creaked with pain, but he stood tall, his spirit stronger than any king's body could ever be. The world that had cast him aside would now tremble before him. Zubri walked in silence under the cloak of night, his mind set on what had been taken from him: his throne, his kingdom, his birthright. His body may have been broken, but the truth was clear to him now. A king is not made by the strength of his body, but by the power of his heart and mind. He arrived at the gates of the royal palace, unnoticed by the guards, who did not recognize the pale figure in tattered robes. He passed silently into the halls that had once been his home, where his father ruled with fear and domination. But now, in the halls of power, it was not King Mwamba who commanded the kingdom. It was the prince who had risen from the grave. The king, now aged and weary, sat on his throne, oblivious to the quiet approach of his son. Zubri stepped into the throne room, his eyes locking with the ruler who had betrayed him. A heavy silence filled the air. The king, seeing the figure before him, trembled. "Father," Zubri's voice echoed across the room, soft but firm. "I have returned." Wamba's face, once proud and unyielding, was now painted with fear and regret. He stood slowly, trembling, as he faced his son, the son he had condemned to death. You are supposed to be dead," the king stammered, disbelief choking his words. "How? I was not meant to die," Zubri interrupted. "And I was never meant to be buried. You buried my body, but my soul is stronger than you could ever understand." King Wamba's knees buckled beneath him as his eyes filled with guilt. He had not anticipated this. He had believed that by silencing his son, he would secure the future of the kingdom. But the truth was undeniable. Zubri was the true heir. Zubri approached the throne, his gaze steady. "You thought that power was found in strength, in the body of a warrior, but it lies in the heart and spirit. And it is I who will rule Ulaya, not through force, but through wisdom and compassion." The king fell to his knees, the weight of his decisions crashing down upon him. Zubri, though weak in body, stood unbroken. The people who had once feared him now turned their gaze upon him, knowing that the true king had risen, not from the earth, but from the trials that sought to destroy him. Zubri's reign would be unlike any other. He ruled with justice, wisdom, and love for his people, understanding that true power came not from a sword or an iron fist, but from the strength within the heart. His story, one of betrayal, death, and resurrection, became a legend, a tale of the prince who, though buried alive, returned to claim his rightful throne. And so, Zubri became the king he was always meant to be. The last breath of royalty was not the death of a prince, but the birth of a ruler who would change the fate of his kingdom forever.